Okay, on to goals now. This is the last topic on exam two, and we'll just be going over this is obviously a very important topic for motivation. So we'll be going over what goals are, some goal characteristics, what setting good goals might look like, and then finally we'll talk about some limitations on these benefits of goal setting. So first, some goal sources. Just to reiterate what I briefly brought up before, goals are cognitive representations of desired end states. This is a very broad thing, right? There's a lot of a very wide variety in goals. Anything from I want to get a job, which is more of a long-term goal, right? Versus I want to tie my shoe right now. It's more of a short-term goal. Yeah, wide variety. So this pint to goal taxonomy gets at classifying four categories of popular goals. And so yeah, categorizing most common goals. This was actually done by Ben Wilkowski and colleagues. So he is a professor at the University of Wyoming. And so we have these four types. So PINT for the pint goal taxonomy. There are prominent goals, including things like success and power. We have inclusiveness goals, which gets at that relation need that we've talked about in the past. There was a negativity prevention category as well. This is more along the lines of avoiding the rejection of others. And then finally, there was a traditional, know how else to summarize that one, but yeah, that's the fourth category here, including various religious goals, pureness, things like that. So what leads to setting a goal? We've talked about a couple of theories that get at explaining this. So first there's drive theory. And so this explains that behavioral intentions or behavioral goals that we have, right, are a product of habit strength as well as drive strength. There are economic models which explain that goals come from various expectations that we have. So expectations of success and expectations of a certain outcome. So we believe that at the end of this goal, there's something that we want, right? And then, or that we want to avoid. And we also have the belief that we can attain this goal. And with both of if we have both of those two things, and the idea is that the likelihood of creating and sticking to this goal is higher. What we are going to talk about in this lecture is the theory of planned behavior as well as cognitive accessibility. So the theory of planned behavior describes behavioral intentions or goals as coming from three various sources. So we have attitude. So having a positive attitude towards engaging in a behavior is going to increase the likelihood of us doing that. Control, so perceived behavioral control here. This is kind of similar to those expectancies we've talked about. So can we or I actually reach this goal? And then what I think really differentiates this theory from others is the social norm aspect. So this is getting at the other people's attitudes on what is normal socially influences our goals. This can look like, peer pressure. So for an example here, talk about quitting smoking based on this theory, right? So does the person want to quit? So if the person thinks that smoking is bad, then the answer to that is probably yes. If the person thinks that they can quit, the likelihood of having that intention, creating that goal to quit is also going to be higher. I certainly know that quitting is not easy per se, but if the individual thinks that it's at least possible to do it, the odds of setting that goal and behaving to reach that goal are higher. And finally, this is also based on the theory of planned behavior dependent on social networks. So if peers are supportive of that smoking and also are smoking themselves, it would be less likely to have this intention to quit versus if peers are supportive of quitting, then that intention will be higher. Kind of an application of this is it's a meta-analysis, so a compilation of a bunch of studies predicting vaccine hesitancy. And so we have various subgroups here about whether, we're talking about the self getting the vaccine or another person or a different vaccine that's not COVID. But anyways, just the takeaway from this is that there was a strong correlation between our attitudes towards the vaccine, perceived ease of getting the vaccine, and social norms for getting the vaccine with actually having the intent to get a vaccine or setting the goal to get the vaccine. So this just supports the theory. Now let's get into that accessibility components. A large part of research on this stems from priming. But anyways, the theory of planned behavior, this is a conscious way of thinking about goals, right? If we're looking at goals in this way, we cognitively have them in our mind, are able to think about them and are aware that we have this goal. That's not always the case with goals. We can certainly have goals that are unconscious, and for unconscious goals, there are various levels in accessibility. And so, in other words, concepts can be chronically or situationally activated. If something is chronically activated, that's something that we think about a lot, versus if something is situationally activated, that's something that we have thought about recently. And so this is the priming aspect. A analogy that I think works well with this in terms of thinking just about accessibility in general is, say we have a Lego box, right? The pieces at the top are, we'll say that those are more accessible, right? And they are likely more accessible at the top, either because we use those pieces frequently or because we use them recently. And interestingly, I'll show an example of this, but more accessible concepts, so those Legos at the top, are going to be more likely to influence quick decisions, because for quick decisions, right, we can't go through all these steps for the that theory of planned behavior that theory requires. We don't have the time for that. So that's where this accessibility is going to come into play more. Additionally, uncertainty plays a large role here, and we'll see that in the example. But one way you might have heard of this before is the saying, go with your gut. And this is basically just, use your accessible information that you have right now and just make that quick decision. So an example here, it's kind of hard. I'll move me over to here. So this was an interesting study on gambling decisions. And so basically participants played kind of like a knockoff blackjack type of game, where I think knockoff because I believe they weren't allowed to, ask for a new card or whatever. And so they were just dealt two cards and they were given a certain amount of money and were given the choice to bet or not. And that was dependent on these first two cards they get and whether they thought that those cards would beat the cards of the dealer. In one condition, however, there was a priming example here where the word gamble just popped up very fast, so fast that it's theorized to be then more of an unconscious thing, right, than consciously, oh, I just saw the word gamble on the screen. And interestingly, results-wise, we find support for what was talked about on the last slide in terms of this accessibility playing a role for ambiguous decisions. And so you see that because the only difference between the bet or the primed condition here and the non-primed, that the prime with bet, prime with pass. The difference is only at about 11, 12, 13. And the idea is that this is where making a decision is more ambiguous. Once you start getting above that, you're pretty sure you're going to win. Once you start getting below that, you're pretty sure you're going to lose. And so this is where if you saw that gamble pop up, you were more likely to actually bet money on this hand. Getting at an example of the chronic accessibility here. So one way that this is pretty consistently looked at is predicting college student drinking. And this is controlling for things where we have a pretty good idea that these influence intent to drink, like sex, past drinking, and Greek life. But important for chronic accessibility is this attitude accessibility right here. So this is chronic attitude accessibility, or how quickly they can articulate their attitude towards alcohol. And as expected, based on what we talked about, this is a significant predictor of intentions to drink. One thing I want to briefly bring up here, because I think it's important, is just I think that the accessibility idea is really important, but take the whole priming thing with maybe a little bit of a grain of salt, because some researchers, including Payne, have realized that priming effects are not maybe that reliable. And so what I mean by that is there are quite a few original studies that found priming effects, but then when we've gotten better at stats and everything, people have gone back and tried to replicate these studies and haven't been able to, which shows that priming effects are kind of iffy on whether they work or not. It's just called the replication crisis for priming. This little bit, you won't be tested on this replication crisis or issues with priming or anything like that, but I just felt a little weird talking about priming without at least mentioning that. Finally here, last slide for this lecture is another way that this accessibility aspect has been researched, which is in the shooter task. And so this gets at the pretty highly debated topic of definitely the last few years now is police use of force. And so in the shooter task, it's on a computer screen, and you see an individual on the screen who either is holding a gun or a different object, and your job as a participant would be to either shoot or not shoot and make that decision as quickly as you can. And so we see from this research, this has been replicated quite a few times, that there do seem to be some implicit biases, getting at kind of this accessibility idea, right? But there are some implicit biases where shooting an individual with a gun is quicker in this task if that individual is a minority. There have been various minorities used in this type of research. And yeah, really, one thing though about the shooter task is that, at least with the original paradigm, I think it does a good job of showing that there are implicit biases, but it's just on a computer, right? So it's not a very realistic way of getting at whether people will shoot or not. I say this just because the shooter task research is moving in a bit of a different direction now, where more VR technology is being used to make these scenarios more realistic. So instead of pressing a button on a keyboard to decide to shoot or not, you actually have still a fake, but something that feels more realistic as a gun in your hand when you're deciding to shoot or not shoot. And we're actually in the department, we'll be running one of these studies relatively soon. But yeah, anyways, just an interesting application, I think, of what we're talking about here, and certainly important for this police use of force topic and the whole idea of implicit biases. And so, yeah, that's it. In the next lecture, we'll go over some goal characteristics.